They forced handcuffs onto General Naomi Carter, a black woman who had given her life to serve this country. In front of the courthouse, Sergeant Rick Donovan mocked her, stripping away her dignity as if her uniform meant nothing. But moments later, when Pentagon officials walked in, the air inside shifted. Would Naomi let their hatred break her, or turn this humiliation into a fight for justice? If this struck a chord with you, please like and share now. Let's step inside and witness how it all unfolded. I was there when everything unraveled at the courthouse. But the morning started in Naomi Carter's apartment. This part we learned later, under oath, and from the evidence she carried in her bag. It was still gray outside when the alarm clicked off. No music, no TV, just the hush you keep when you're saving your voice for a fight. On the kitchen table lay a single sheet, a court summons. It accused her of favoring black service members in assignments and commendations. A talking point dressed up as a charge. Naomi read it once more the way soldiers double-check a map they already know by heart. The words didn't shake, her hands didn't either. She'd seen worse in places that don't make the news. She set the paper down and smoothed the front of her uniform. Not a parade shine, just neat earned. The small row of ribbons caught a sliver of window light on. Her fingertips paused over one in particular, and for a moment you could almost hear the nose of another life dust. Rotors of radio cutting out mid-sentence. Worry crossed her face like a cloud, then passed. You don't outrank fear, you stand beside it. Beside the summons was a framed photo of her son, freshman year dorm hallway behind him, the same shy grin he'd worn in Little League. Next to it lay a letter in her mother's careful hand, a short blessing, a scripture line underlined twice, and one sentence that mattered most. Do not let them tell you who you are. Naomi read that sentence again, and the edges of her mouth softened. Coffee was quick and quiet. 2 sips of breath, then the small habits that keep a person steady. Rinse the cup, fold the dish towel, check the lock. She opened the closet, took the black leather portfolio she used for briefings, and slid the summons inside. No extra papers, no speeches. She wasn't going to perform. She was going to answer. Before she left, she stood by the table and rested her palm on the photo frame. Her lips moved with a line that later made the transcript. If I don't stand for myself today, what lesson will I leave for him? Not loud, not dramatic, like someone tying a final knot before a climb. Out on the sidewalk, it was one of those tidy city mornings. Delivery trucks idling, a runner tapping past with earbuds, a crossing guard lifting a hand. Naomi walked without hurry. She didn't lower her eyes and she didn't scan for approval. A bus pulled up and a few faces happened to turn. Some held that quick, puzzled look people wear when reality doesn't match the picture in their head. A black woman in a general's uniform at 700 a.m. doesn't fit many people's morning story. She passed a storefront window and caught the faint reflection of her cap. Straight enough, shoulders square. She tugged once at the cuff where the stitching had frayed, one of those tiny imperfections no one else would notice, the kind that reminds you you're still human inside all that fabric and metal. 2 blocks from the courthouse, she paused at a light. The marble building rose ahead, calm as a sermon. You could stand there and believe and process the seal over the door, the flag at the pole, the sweep of steps worn smooth by years of feet. Naomi let herself look at it the way you look at an old promise. Then she exhaled, and the promise turned back into a task. She didn't bring an escort. Her counsel would meet her inside. That was the plan. No cameras, no staffer walking half a step behind. Naomi believed in showing up the ordinary way when the accusation is that your rank has made you special. She believed in that, even knowing how the world sometimes reads a uniform on the wrong body. On the final block, the sidewalk thickened with courthouse traffic, jurors with paperwork, a woman in a navy blazer shepherding a witness, 2 teenagers whispering over a phone. Naomi's shoes clicked in a steady rhythm. A security officer glanced over, did a small double take, and then this part matters, looked away, the neutral mask people wear when they don't want to be caught staring. A breeze lifted, and with it, the city sounds shifted, horn farther off, a laugh from across the street, a siren somewhere you couldn't place. Naomi reached into the portfolio, checked the corner of the summons, like a pilot tapping the glass on an altimeter, then closed it again. No need to rehearse. She knew exactly what she would say, that standards are standards, that citations are earned, that fairness has a smell you learn to trust. At the base of the steps that she paused with the others, waiting for the doors to open fully. She wasn't crowding anyone. She wasn't making room. A man in a ball cap slid out of the way and offered a polite, "Ma'am, the kind you give before you look twice and think, is she?" Naomi's answer was the slightest nod. One thing you should understand about this moment, the morning didn't feel like a storm yet. It felt like air gathering in a room before the door shuts. There was no hint of shouting, no sense that names would be called or lines crossed. If anything, the tension came from everything that still seemed possible. An honest hearing, a fair question, a clean walk back down those steps. Naomi set her foot on the first riser and climbed. The stone was cool through her soles. She kept her hands-free cap brim low enough to shade but not hide her eyes. The flag's ropes clacked twice against the pole. She looked up at the sound on instinct, then brought her gaze back to the entrance. Inside her head, the map was simple. Present, the facts own what's hers, refuse what isn't. She wasn't there to argue the worth of a career. She was there to refuse a lie. If you were standing near her, you'd have felt it, the quiet kind of resolve that doesn't need to be declared. When the doors finally opened, the lobby's cool air hurried out to meet the street. People flowed forward in that half-shuffle of courthouse mornings. Naomi stepped with them, one of many and not one of many at all. A marshal's radio crackled from somewhere beyond security. The metal detector beeped for someone else and then cleared. Naomi drew a breath and lifted her chin. That's how her day began, steady, alone, and headed into a building where truth and spectacle lived side by side. None of us outside knew what would happen next. Naomi did not either. She only knew what she had chosen for herself, for her son, and for the name on the uniform she wore, as if it were the signature of every person who'd ever trusted her to be fair. And with that, she walked toward the hall where everything would be decided. I was on the lower steps when she reached the courthouse doors, close enough to hear the scrape of boot leather, close enough to see the look that crossed Sergeant Rick Donovan's face. He didn't check a list or ask a routine question. He looked Naomi Carter up and down like someone inspecting a counterfeit bill. Chin tilted, lips set for a smirk. "So you're the so-called general, looks more like a fraud to me." Naomi didn't rise to it. She opened a black portfolio and held out the summons, and her military ID steady as a level. You could read the bold letters on the paper if you were standing where I was. The seal, the date, the time. It was all there. Donovan didn't lean in, he leaned back. "Fake papers won't save you." That's when the air changed. Two people near me lifted their phones without thinking, the way you'd raise an umbrella at the first drop of rain. A courthouse clerk slowed on the landing, unsure if she should step around or stay put. A security marshal glanced up from the magnetometer and froze between duty and habit. No one wanted to be first. Naomi didn't flinch. "Sergeant, I'm here under summons," she said, calm, even the kind of voice officers use to diffuse a room. She did not announce her resume. She didn't point at the ribbons. She simply offered the documents again. Donovan didn't take them. He studied her uniform like it was a costume. A beat past one of those beats that stretches thin and makes people choose who they're going to be in public. He chose loud. "Step back," he barked, though she hadn't stepped forward. His hand hovered near her elbow in that warning hover cops use when they want everyone watching to know who's in charge. Two more officers drifted closer, drawn by volume more than cause. From behind me, a man said, "What's going on?" The answer was obvious and not simple. A black woman in a general's uniform was being treated like a trespasser at the door of a building that prints due process on its letterhead. Naomi kept the portfolio open. She didn't argue the past or predict the future. "These will show you what you need," she said, and her tone made it clear she expected the process to do its job. Donovan gave the papers a glance that never turned into a look. He shook his head, almost pleased with himself. "I said they won't save you." The phones around us rose higher. Someone whispered, "Is this for real?" Another voice, "Just film it." The whisper carried the way whispers do when a crowd agrees not to intervene. Donovan moved first. He caught her wrist, spun it behind her in one practiced turn, and dragged her other arm to meet it. The motion was clean, almost bored. A snap of metal, then another. The cuffs flashed small and bright against the dark of her sleeves. "Let everyone see this is what happens when you lie," he announced, projecting it to the stairs, to the lenses, to the idea of authority he seemed to love performing. It wasn't a statement, it was staging. The sound that followed wasn't a shout. It was a collective intake of breath, the kind people make when a glass tips and they know it will break. A woman beside me said, "Sir," and lost the rest of her sentence. The clerk on the landing stepped backward and knocked her file into the rail. Papers feathered and skated in the morning breeze. A teenager laughed the wrong laugh people do when they're scared and don't want to be. Naomi's face changed, but not the way he wanted. Pain landed and stayed right there in the eyes, the kind you can't blink away. But her chin lifted half an inch and she found a patch of air that was hers. She didn't yank, she didn't plead, she didn't search the crowd for allies. She stared level somewhere past the sergeant's shoulder, as if fixing on a horizon line that steadies you when the deck tilts. I remember the small things. The cap strap pressing into her cheek as her shoulders drew back. The tick of Donovan's jaw when he realized she wasn't going to give him a scene. The way the phones quivered in a dozen hands because the people holding them knew they were filming something that would watch them back later. "Turn around," he ordered, though she already had. He nudged her toward the doors with a palm between her shoulder blades in a pace too quick for dignity. The cuffs bit once at the seam of her sleeve. She winced and caught the wince before it could become a sound. That was the only time I saw her let anything loose. "Sir, maybe check," the security marshal started, but Donovan cut him off with a look and a louder voice. "We'll handle this," he said, meaning I'll handle this, meaning you won't. The crowd parted the way crowds do when uniforms move through them. A few faces were angry, more were curious, one or two carried something like relief, the relief of not being the one in the middle. A woman in a navy blazer held her phone low and recorded anyway. You could see the red dot in her screen like a pilot light. Naomi lifted her head as they steered her onto the top step. She found me for a second, or maybe it was someone over my shoulder, but the glance landed. In it, I saw the echo of the line I'd later read in the transcript. "If I don't stand for myself today, what lesson will I leave for him?" You don't hear a sentence like that. You feel it tuck itself under your ribs. "Keep it moving," Donovan said louder than necessary. He wanted the hallway to hear him before he reached it. He wanted the story to arrive a half step ahead of the facts. "Racist cops," someone muttered behind me, not brave enough to attach a name. Another voice said, "Maybe she forged it," and the words hung there like punk, thick enough to hide and thin enough to breathe. Naomi didn't try to clear her name on the steps. She didn't throw titles at the crowd or demand respect from a man who had decided not to give it. She did the thing people don't know how to film. She chose poise when poise costs. Her shoulders squared, her eyes steadied, the cuffs stayed. If you ask me what the worst part was, it wasn't the medal or the shove. It was the sentence delivered like theater. "Let everyone see." He was talking to us, deputizing strangers into an audience for a humiliation he'd scripted. And most of us accepted the roles because the door was opening and the day was moving and nobody wants to be the one who stops a machine. They pushed through the threshold, the lobby air washing over them, cooler than outside. The phones followed. The clerk gathered her loose papers with a shaking hand. I hesitated a beat, then stepped in after them because something in me said the line we'd just crossed wasn't just the doorway. It was the point where a country decides how it recognizes its servants. That was the moment the story changed shape from a summons and a morning routine into a public lesson. And as Naomi disappeared under the arch with steel around her wrists and her head unbowed, I understood what kind of lesson it might be. Not the kind you memorize, the kind you remember because it hurts. I remember the sound more than anything, the hollow clap of boots striking marble as Sergeant Donovan marched General Naomi Carter through the courthouse hall. The cuffs were still on her wrists, metal flashing under fluorescent light, and each step seemed louder than the last. People turned. Secretaries paused mid-conversation. A juror in a gray jacket leaned to his neighbor and muttered, "She doesn't even look like a general." The words traveled quick, careless, as if spoken loud enough to be true. Donovan caught it, grinned, and leaned close enough for all of us to hear. "Your little act ends here." He dragged the syllables, enjoying them like he wanted the building itself to know he had won. His tone wasn't about procedure, it was about theater. And the hallway gave him his audience. Phones tilted upward again. Whisper trails curled through the crowd. Some faces were puzzled, others satisfied confirmation of what they wanted to believe. Naomi kept her chin level, but I could see the tension behind it. Her jaw tight, her breath slow like she was carrying weight she hadn't expected to bear this morning. The sound of those boots echoed sharp ricocheting off tile and glass. They weren't just footsteps, they were punctuation. Each strike hammered the same message, guilty before proven, shame before heard. That sound, I'll tell you, stuck harder than any insult. For the first time that day, Naomi's gaze shifted inward. It was subtle, but you could see it. Her eyes unfocused, her shoulders pulled in just a shade. And in that silence between steps, I swear you could hear her own question, even if she never spoke it out loud. What if they're right? What if everything I've fought for means nothing? It was a dangerous thought. You could see it in the slight sag of her frame, the half second when her head tilted down as though the weight of their judgment was too much. This was no performance. This was a crack, a human one, a moment where dignity alone wasn't enough. And the crowd, hungry for confirmation, leaned into it. A man chuckled under his breath. A woman shook her head. Their judgment piled higher, heavier. But then something shifted. Naomi's eyes dulled for a moment, flickered alive again. I've seen soldiers look that way when memory breaks through the fog of fear. It was as if the hallway vanished, and she stood once more on foreign soil. Dust, smoke, the staccato of gunfire, and her brothers, black, brown, white, falling beside her. One of them had reached for her hand with blood on his sleeve, and she had pulled him clear. Another had not made it. Their faces, their voices pressed against her ribs. They had bled the same red no matter what anyone here chose to see. The strength didn't flood back like a tide, it returned like a stubborn flame that refused to go out. Naomi straightened just slightly enough for Donovan to notice and scowl. The doubt was still there, but it had company now. Memory, loyalty, something deeper than shame. She didn't smile, she didn't fight the cuffs, but her silence changed texture. It wasn't surrender anymore, it was defiance. I caught it, and I think others did too. One of the clerks lowered her phone, uneasy. A guard by the elevator blinked twice as if reconsidering what he was witnessing. But Donovan kept his grip firm, his smirk fixed. He wanted the story to be humiliation, not resilience. He barked again, louder this time. Keep walking, Carter. Show's over. But anyone paying attention knew the show was shifting. The boots still struck marble, still echoed like a drumbeat of disgrace, but Naomi's shoulders squared as though she'd found her rhythm within it. If earlier those echoes sounded like shame, now they sounded like stubborn proof she was still standing. Every strike said, I am here. I am not broken. Not yet. That was the paradox of that hallway. On the surface, she was a prisoner marched like a criminal, paraded before whispering strangers. But if you looked at her face in that instant, the tightening jaw, the distant but burning eyes, you could tell the story wasn't only humiliation. It was the spark of something harder to break. A woman carrying memory like armor. A woman daring herself not to collapse. And I'll tell you, sitting there watching, I didn't see a fraud. I saw a person fighting a battle none of us could fight for her. A battle not against bullets or bombs, but against the steady poison of being doubted, dismissed, erased. That was the moment I realized the real courtroom wasn't behind the oak doors ahead. It was already here in this hallway, in the space between each echoing step. And Naomi, though cuffed, though doubted, was already on the stand. They pushed her through a side door, down a short stairwell, and into a holding cell meant for the overflow bare walls, a single bench bolted to the floor light that buzzed more than it glowed. The clang of the door shut behind her was heavier than the cuffs themselves. Cold, stale air pressed in from every angle, the kind that makes you feel smaller just by breathing it. There was already a man inside. Mid-40s maybe, skin the same shade as hers, but lined deeper by time and bad luck. He had that restless look of someone who'd been in and out of rooms like this too many times. His name, I learned later, was Darius. He glanced at Naomi, took in the uniform, the posture, the cuffs still locked at her wrists. His chuckle had no humor. They said, you're a general, doesn't look like one. It wasn't just mockery, it was defense, a way of keeping distance. Still, the words landed sharp like grit in an open wound. Before Naomi could reply, Officer Miller, the younger one who'd followed Donovan, leaned against the bars with his arms crossed. He had the energy of someone eager to prove himself, but not quite sure how. If you were really a general, he said with a smirk, you wouldn't be here. That was the double blow. Stranger and cop both making her rank sound like a costume she'd borrowed. For the first time that day, Naomi sagged onto the bench. Shoulders that had carried command slumped forward. She stared at the floor as if searching for something steady and found only cracked concrete. You could see it, her spirit falter, if only for a moment. The question from the hallway whispered again inside her. What if they're right? Her throat tightened. The paper summons the cameras, the sneers, it all pressed down, and for an instant she seemed ready to let it. But memory has its own way of breaking into despair. Her mind snapped back to the field sun beating down smoke, curling a young private bleeding out at her side, his hand gripping hers with the last of his strength. She'd told him he wouldn't be left behind, and she had kept that promise. She remembered another moment pulling her team through an ambush, radio shot out trust, holding stronger than steel. Those faces, those names weren't distant, they were with her still. And layered over it came her son's smile, the one in the photograph she'd touched that morning. His eyes held the same quiet hope she now had to carry. If I don't stand, what lesson will I leave for him? The weight shifted, her spine drew straight, again, not defiant, not triumphant, just steady. The silence stretched. Miller grew restless, expecting protest, expecting her to sputter like anyone caught off guard. But Naomi gave him nothing. No plea, no correction, only stillness. And then she said it almost under her breath, but clear enough for the room to catch. Sometimes true strength is in silence. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't rehearsed. It was truth distilled into one line, the kind you only believe when you've paid for it. Darius blinked. His smirk faltered, replaced by something closer to curiosity. He'd seen plenty of people collapse in here, men twice his size begging for phone calls, women sobbing into their sleeves. But he hadn't seen this. A woman cuffed, mocked, cornered, choosing stillness like it was armor. Miller looked away, the confidence in his grin dented by a doubt he didn't want to admit. And Naomi, she lifted her head, eyes steady now, as if to remind them and herself that humiliation could touch her skin, but not strip her core. For the first time in that cell, the cold walls didn't seem to press so close. I can tell you this much, the room hadn't changed. It was still the same dim, sour cell, but Naomi Carter's presence in it had. And Darius sitting across from her felt it too. You could see it in his face, the slow shift from dismissal to a kind of respect he wasn't ready to name. It was the beginning of a turn, the first spark of something that would ripple through every person in that courthouse before the day was done. The cell door banged open and Sergeant Rick Donovan walked in like he owned the place. He didn't hurry. He sauntered, shoulders, loose lips curled into a grin as if he'd already won. His eyes went straight to Naomi's portfolio resting on the bench beside her. Well, he drawled, let's see what kind of lies you're hiding in here. Naomi sat still, wrists bound in front of her, offering no protest. Rick snatched the leather folder and began rifling through the contents, snapping each page louder than the last, playing to his own audience. Darius leaned forward from the corner, suspicion sharpening in his eyes. Miller, the young officer, folded his arms and tried to look amused, but he was watching closely. And then it happened. Something slipped free, a single card stiff and glossy. It spun once in the air and landed on the concrete with a clean, unmistakable tack. The sound carried through the cell like a gavel strike. The Pentagon seal stared back at us. Clear, unforgiving. Miller's mouth fell open. Darius shot to his feet, chains clinking as if he'd forgotten he wore them. No way, he breathed. Even Donovan froze. He bent down, picked it up slowly, and turned it over in his hands, staring longer than he should have. The grin faltered, but pride forced his lips into something like a smile. This could be fake, he muttered. He tried for confidence, but his voice cracked thin at the edges. Naomi didn't answer. She lifted her eyes to his steady, unblinking calm. No defense, no argument, just silence. And that silence struck harder than any words could have. The shift was immediate. Miller's stance loosened. Doubt flickered in his young eyes. Darius shook his head slowly, realizing he'd judged too quickly. Even Donovan seemed smaller, under the weight of a truth he couldn't bend. He tossed the card back onto the bench. Anybody can print one of these, he said louder this time. But the sound of the ID hitting the wood was flat hollow. Naomi leaned back against the wall. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence filled the space, turning the power in the room without a single word spoken. That moment was electric. Every breath hung heavier. The humiliation meant for her had turned into revelation for everyone else. And though the cuffs still bound her wrists, there was no doubt who held the authority now. The silence after that Pentagon card hit the floor stretched on like a held breath. Rick Donovan picked it up, but the swagger was gone from his shoulders. He turned it over in his hands too many times as if the seal might rub off if he stared hard enough. His throat worked before his voice did. "We'll verify this with the Pentagon," he barked, but the bark carried a tremor. The words were meant to sound decisive, yet the crack in his tone betrayed him. It wasn't command, it was cover. Officer Miller shifted at the bars. A few minutes earlier, he'd echoed Donovan's sneer, certain of the story he was helping stage. But the card, the seal, Naomi's steady eyes, it unsettled him. His jaw clenched and unclenched. Somewhere in that silence, another voice echoed one he hadn't expected, his father's. His father, a Vietnam vet, had told him once about a night patrol gone wrong, how a black sergeant had dragged him out of a ditch with bullets cracking overhead. "That man saved my life," his father had said, and the country never thanked him for it. Miller had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to old war stories. But now, standing here watching a black woman in cuffs hold herself with more dignity than anyone in uniform around her, those words came back heavy. Darius broke the silence first. He wasn't mocking this time. His voice came low, almost reverent. "If that's real, then we've all been blind." It wasn't said to Rick or to Miller, not even to Naomi alone. It was said to the room, to the system, maybe to the country itself. His words didn't echo on the walls, they echoed in the air between us, in the uneasy glances that passed from man to man. Naomi didn't seize the moment. She didn't speak. She just sat, her hands cuffed her back against cold concrete, eyes locked on Rick. That look wasn't anger, it was something heavier. A question without words. A test. She was daring him, daring all of them to look at her and decide whether they'd keep pretending not to see. The air thickened. You could feel it in your chest, like being underwater too long. No one wanted to move first. Donovan's jaw ground tight as he shoved the card back onto the bench. The clatter sounded weak, defensive. He avoided her eyes, focusing on Miller, as though daring him to step out of line. Miller didn't speak, but his silence wasn't the same as Naomi's. Hers carried strength. His carried doubt. His father's voice pressed against his ribs, the memory refusing to loosen. Darius leaned back on the bench, shaking his head. His gaze on Naomi had shifted again, no longer skeptical, no longer dismissive. He looked at her like a man realizing he'd just been shown something undeniable. Rick tried to fill the air with authority, again muttering about procedures, verifications, chains of command. But none of it stuck. His words fell flat against the thick quiet Naomi had drawn around herself. And that's how it stayed. No shouting, no movement. Just that waiting tension, the kind you feel before glass shatters. The cell wasn't only holding bodies now, it was holding truth too, and it was too big to stay caged. Everyone in that room knew it. You could see it in Miller's jaw and Darius's eyes, even in the stiffness of Rick's shoulders. Something was about to give. We were all waiting for the break. I swear you could feel the tension pressing against the walls, ready to burst. Then the door swung open so hard the hinges rattled. Every head turned. Two figures stepped through and the air shifted like a storm front moving in. It turned out one of the courthouse clerks had quietly placed a call after witnessing Naomi Carter being cuffed on the steps. That call had reached the right ears, and now those ears had walked into the room in full uniform. Admiral Thomas Gray entered first, broad shoulders, white hair sharp against the dark blue of his dress coat. At his side was Colonel Elena Brooks, younger, but every bit as commanding, eyes like steel trained straight on Rick Donovan. They hadn't come for show. They'd come for order. For a beat, the cell was silent, but for Miller's quick breath. Darius's jaw dropped and his chain clinked as he stood half upright, unable to believe who was in front of him. Donovan, the sergeant who'd swaggered and sneered all morning, froze like a child caught with his hand in the till. His mouth worked, but no sound came. Naomi didn't move. She simply stood, hands still cuffed, her back straight. Her calm in that moment made the uniforms beside her look like they'd been summoned by her will. Admiral Gray's voice broke the silence. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His words cut clean. Release General Carter. Now. The weight of those words slammed into the room harder than any gavel. Miller's face went pale. Sweat gathered at his temples. He glanced at Rick, waiting desperate for instruction. Rick swallowed hard, Adam's apple-bobbing eyes darting between Gray and Naomi as if there might still be a way out. When he finally found his voice, it wavered. We didn't know," Colonel Brooks snapped before he could finish. Her tone was razor sharp, slicing through every excuse he might have hidden behind. No, you didn't want to know. The words landed like a strike. A few people gasped. Darius muttered under his breath, "Damn," shaking his head as if justice itself had walked through that door. Rick's face drained of color. The same man who'd paraded Naomi like a criminal now stood exposed, stripped of the false authority he'd wrapped himself in. His shoulders slumped. The swagger bled out of him, leaving only a man caught in the glare of truth. Gray's eyes never left him. "Remove those cuffs immediately." Hands trembling, Rick fumbled with the keys. The metallic click of the lock breaking open echoed through the cell like freedom itself. Naomi drew her hands forward, flexed her wrists once, then lowered them calmly. No gloating, no smirk, just quiet dignity. The silence after was the kind that makes your chest tight. Everyone in that room knew the balance had shifted. What had been humiliation was now vindication. And the man who thought himself the enforcer was reduced to nothing more than an embarrassed guard fumbling with keys. For us, watching the scene was electric, an eruption without a shout. The kind of moment that made you want to laugh, not because it was funny, but because watching arrogance collapse under truth is the sweetest kind of justice. That was the third high point of the day, the one that left every witness knowing they'd seen something bigger than a confrontation in a cell. They had seen the weight of power flip in an instant, and it was glorious. They just unlocked the cuffs when the room did what rooms always do after a shock. It reached for the next easy move. Admiral Gray turned slightly, ready to guide Naomi out. Colonel Brooks stepped in, close, protective by instinct. Everyone assumed the scene was over. You could feel the collective exhale. Thank God, this part is finished. Brooks kept her voice low, professional, almost gentle. "General, let's go. You don't need to prove anything." Naomi didn't answer right away. She flexed her wrists, once testing blood and bone, then reached into the leather portfolio on the bench. Not for the summons, for a small, worn photograph. Her son's freshman year smile looked back at her, awkward, hopeful. The kind of smile that makes a parent want the world to behave. She held the picture in her palm like you hold a compass. I was close enough to see the way her eyes changed. Whatever had carried her through the cuffs and the sneers, discipline, memory, sheer, stubborn grace, met something else now. Choice. She could leave with her rank intact and her dignity restored, or she could turn around and make this room answer for what it had done. You don't always hear decisions being made. Sometimes you watch them land. Naomi looked at the photo, and I saw her lips move so faint I only caught it later in the transcript. If I walk away, what changes? If I stay, maybe justice begins here. She slid the photo back into the portfolio and lifted her head. The hush that followed wasn't fearful this time. It was expectant. If justice matters, she said, voice steady, it starts here, today. No grand speech, no condemnation, just a line simple enough to survive replay. Gray's jaw set. Brooks studied Naomi for a beat, weighing risk against principle, protocol against truth. Then the two senior officers exchanged a look that said they were soldiers first. They nodded. Brooks turned to the nearest court officer. "Who's the floor supervisor?" "We need a judge and the clerk of court now." Her tone made the request a directive. The officer didn't argue. He moved. Gray faced Donovan. "Sergeant, you will stand down and remain available for questioning." It wasn't bluster. It was housekeeping, the kind you do when a room is about to become a record. Miller swallowed and stepped back from the bars, suddenly less sure of every word he'd said that morning. Darius, still half standing, watched Naomi with a look I'd seen on grieving families when a chaplain says something that actually helps, surprise at the feeling of air returning to their lungs. General Brooks tried once more, softer. "Now this will be public." "I know," Naomi said. "It should be." The clerk who had placed the first call appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, papers hugged to her chest. Behind her, two marshals and a courthouse administrator. Things move quickly when people understand they have been seen. A room was secured. A judge was notified that an incident intersected with a scheduled proceeding. The phrase on the record began to pass from mouth to mouth. No one said spectacle. The building was built to avoid that word, but we all knew what was coming, a room where truth and theater share the same microphone. As the cluster of officials formed, Donovan tried one last time to reclaim ground. "This isn't necessary," he said, but the sentence had no place to land. Brooks didn't dignify it with reply. Gray put a hand near Naomi's shoulder, not leading her, not claiming her, just there. a human acknowledgement in a day that had offered her very little of that. We filed out of the holding area in an odd procession. A general who'd been paraded like a thief, the officers who had come to stop the bleeding, a chastened sergeant, a young cop learning too much about himself, a clerk who'd chosen to act, and a man named Darius, who had come in one kind of witness and would leave another. As we moved up the stairwell, the building sound returned the elevator bell, the hum of fluorescence, the courtroom doors thudding closed somewhere ahead. People along the corridor looked up and then looked again. Some recognized Gray's rank, others recognized Naomi's face from the phones now buzzing in their pockets. The story was outrunning us. At the doorway to the assigned courtroom, Brooks paused with a marshal. "We'll open the gallery," she said. "Within reason. No disruptions." The marshal nodded, already setting the boundary rope and clearing the aisle. A court reporter slid into place, fingers poised above the keys like a pianist at the first downbeat. Naomi stepped just inside, then stopped at the threshold, and for a heartbeat we all stopped with her. She wasn't posing. She was making sure she could do this without rage, without collapse. She drew one breath the way soldiers draw, aim slow, deliberate, on purpose. Behind us I heard Miller say, maybe to himself, maybe to anyone who'd listen, "We should have looked." The words didn't excuse him. They named the failure. Darius eased into the back row, chain clinking once against the wood, then going quiet. He sat forward, palms on his knees, eyes fixed on the place where Naomi would stand. Gray took a place along the side wall, refusing the front table. Brooks spoke briefly to the clerk and the judge's assistant, then returned to Naomi. "We'll follow your lead, General." Naomi nodded. "We'll let the record show what happened," she said. "Not a threat, a plan. And here's the thing I'll remember as long as I have memory to spend the feel of the room when she chose to stay. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vengeance. It was steadiness, the kind you want your children to see when the world gets it wrong, the kind that turns a private humiliation into a public line in the sand." The judge's doors opened. We rose out of habit and hope. Naomi stepped forward, not as a defendant and not as a victim, but as a witness to what the morning had asked of her and what she decided to give back. The twist everyone expected, a quiet exit, a closed door fix, never came. Instead, she took the moment that should have broken her and made it useful. And as the gavel called the room to order, it was clear the real fight wasn't on the steps after all. It would be fought here, where words become record and record becomes what a country remembers. By the time the judge took the bench, the clip of Naomi Carter in cuffs had already outrun the morning. Phones vibrated through pockets. Tripods rose at the back like a thicket. The judge glanced at the cameras, then at the seal above his head. "This proceeding will remain orderly," he said, voice level. "The court will make a record of what occurred in the South Lobby. No grandstanding, no outbursts. All rise." We stood. "Be seated." Colonel Brooks leaned toward Naomi. "General, we can request a continuance." Naomi shook her head once. "No, we'll do it now." The clerk read the matter, dry words for something that had already bled into the public square. The court reporter set her fingers over the keys, waiting. "General Carter," the judge said, "do you wish to make a statement?" "I do." She raised her right hand, swore in, and stepped to the lectern. No notes, no escort, just a straight spine and a quiet that settled the room. "I came here under summons," she began. "I came to answer questions about how we recognize service and whether I treated anyone differently because of who they are." Her eyes moved over us, then returned to the bench. "I won't argue my record. I'll tell you what I've seen." She offered the court scenes instead of speeches. Kandahar, night convoy, radio dead in a dust storm. A medic Black 22 sprinted into open ground because a Marine he'd never met was bleeding out behind a dead truck. He took a round in the thigh and kept pressure on a stranger's wound until the bird lifted. I signed his commendation. Not for his color, for his courage. Sergeant Rick Donovan shifted in his seat, hands white on the bench. "Your Honor, you'll speak when addressed," Sergeant, the judge said without looking at him. Naomi continued. "Stateside, training flight. Young pilot Black lost half a windshield in a bird strike, brought his co-pilot down with nothing but his hands and his voice. I wrote that citation myself, because the work was done, because the standard was met." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words were stones laid one after another, making a path the room could not pretend not to see. The judge nodded. "For the record, did you present identification this morning?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Was it examined?" She looked toward Rick, then back. "It was not. A murmur rippled. The judge lifted a hand, and the sound died. Colonel Brooks stood. "Your Honor, the clerk." She nodded to the woman hugging papers near the door, placed a call after witnessing the restraint at the entrance. Admiral Gray and I were already in the building for a scheduled proceeding. "We responded immediately," noted the judge said. "Sergeant Donovan, did you attempt to verify the credentials presented?" Rick's mouth worked. "I believe them to be counterfeit." "Believe," the judge repeated. "Did you verify?" "No, Your Honor." The words were gravel. Behind him, Officer Miller stared at the floor. Under his breath, so soft I might have imagined it, he said, "We should have looked." Naomi let the exchange pass. Then she set her hands on the lectern and gave us the line that would outlast the day. "Their blood was the same red as yours. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be." The sentence struck clean, and the room went perfectly still. Cameras forgot to whirl. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. I felt it land under my ribs like a true thing finally spoken where it counts. Miller bowed his head, not for show, just because there was nothing else to do with it. His father's voice, the one about a black sergeant hauling him out of a ditch in Vietnam, seemed to sit down beside him. Rick gripped the bench harder, as if wood could hold him up. He didn't meet Naomi's eyes. He stared at the grain. From the back row, Darius blinked hard and lost a tear. He rubbed it away with thumb and forefinger, then raised his hand halfway before he remembered his chain. "Your Honor," he said, voice rough. "May I one sentence?" The judge waited. "State your name for the record." "Darius Cole, proceed." "One sentence," Darius swallowed. "My little brother wore the uniform. He didn't come home." "What she said is true." Silence again. Not the empty kind, the kind that clarifies. The judge let it stand until it became part of the record. "Then, General, anything further?" Naomi shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I'll answer questions." The questions were spare and surgical. "Why alone?" "Because I was summoned." "Did anyone attempt to check your ID?" "No." "Did you resist?" "No." Each answer landed with the same calm weight. Brooks offered the timeline: call, place, response, made, cuffs removed. Admiral Gray added only, "For the record, General Carter is who she says she is." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Rick tried once more. "Your Honor, with respect, there's a lot of counterfeit out there, Sergeant." The judge cut in. "There is also procedure. You will sit." He sat. The room felt tight with what had shifted. We weren't watching a rescue anymore. We were watching a recalibration. A country deciding for 1 minute to believe what is in front of its face. Naomi looked toward the back, just for a heartbeat, and met Darius's eyes. He mouthed, "Thank you." She didn't nod. She didn't need to. The judge closed his folder. "The court will order an immediate inquiry into the events in the South Lobby. Findings will be public. Further referrals as necessary." He paused, less a coda than a permission. "General Carter, this court appreciates your testimony." Naomi stepped back from the lectern. No smile, no victory posture, just steady. We rose to adjourn. Reporters remembered their buttons. Phones lit up. Miller used the back of his hand on his eyes. Rick remained seated, shoulders small. Darius stared at the empty space Naomi had occupied, as if the sentence still floated there, and he didn't want to disturb it. On the way out, a marshal muttered, "I'll be telling my kids about that line." He didn't say which one. He didn't have to. If you asked me what made the scalp prickle and the breath hitch, it wasn't punishment or spectacle. It was a woman taking it a private humiliation and turning it into witness clean, spare, unarguable. And as the gavel came down, the only thing I could think was that some sentences are short because that's the only way they'll fit inside a heart and stay. Their blood was the same red as yours. When the gavel finally came down, the room exhaled. Not relief, something heavier. Something that felt like a line drawn where one hadn't been before. Naomi Carter walked out first. No escort, no cameras cleared for her. Just the slow, steady rhythm of her steps down the courthouse corridor. The gallery file behind her hushed, as if we'd all witnessed more than testimony, we'd witnessed a shift. At the doors, the sunlight poured in. The crowd outside had swelled, words spreading faster than the case itself. Phones raised voices, hushed, but no one shouted. The mass of people simply parted, making a path for her. That silence, that reverence, was louder than any cheer could have been. Halfway down the steps, Naomi stopped. She turned, eyes sweeping across the crowd, across the officers who had doubted her, the reporters clutching mics, the bystanders who had filmed her humiliation. She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. Power, she said, voice steady, carrying without a microphone, is not in the rank you wear, but in the dignity you refuse to surrender. It landed the way true things do, no applause line, no chant, just the kind of sentence that bends into memory and stays there. The clip went everywhere before she reached the sidewalk. First the cuffing, then the hearing, then that single line on the courthouse steps. News anchors called it the quote of the year. Commentators argued, but the image of Naomi standing tall while others bowed their heads traveled farther than their voices. Within hours, she was on every feed, not just a general, but a symbol. For Darius, the change was quieter. I saw him later walking out with his chain loosened, face softer than when he'd first mocked her in that cell. He smiled, not wide, not easy, but hopeful. The kind of smile a man wears when he realizes he's not as blind as he feared. Miller filed his paperwork within the week. Rumors said he asked for reassignment out of Donovan's unit closer to veteran outreach. When pressed, he told someone in confidence, "I don't want to be the kind of man who forgets who saved his father." Rick Donovan didn't get that chance. He was suspended pending review, stripped of his badge, the same way he'd stripped Naomi of her dignity on those steps. Except hers had returned brighter for the attempt to tarnish it. His once swagger, now silence. That evening, Naomi went home. No speeches, no cameras. She slipped off the uniform and laid it carefully across the back of a chair. Her hand lingered on the ribbons for a beat before moving to the framed photo on the table. Her son's smile met her again, same as it had that morning. She lifted the photo, breathed once, and whispered, "This fight was worth it." Not loud, not for the world, just for herself, her family, and the men and women whose stories had carried her through. That's how it ended. No parade, no explosion of noise, just a steady woman reclaiming what was hers and leaving us with something to hold. And I'll tell you this, for the older folks who watched it live, who carried their own memories of being silenced, sidelined, doubted it was more than news. It was recognition. Proof that dignity can stand taller than rank, that truth can outlast humiliation. The story didn't close that day. It settled in the bones of everyone who heard it. And if you ask me, that's the measure of a fight well fought, when it leaves behind not noise, but silence that makes you think long after the steps are empty. And that's the heart of today's story. Naomi Carter's journey reminds us that true power doesn't come from titles or uniforms, but from the dignity we refuse to surrender. It's a lesson in courage and justice, and in never letting prejudice define who we are. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with some who needs to hear it, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay with us here on Mr. Max Stories. Your support is more than numbers. It's what gives our team the strength to keep bringing you meaningful, powerful stories that stay with you long after they end. Remember, when you see the name Mr. Max Stories, think of it as a symbol, a place where truth, dignity, and justice will always find a voice.